Mayor, you may proceed.
Thank you, Max. Good morning, everybody. It is Tuesday, February 1st, 2020. This is a virtual special meeting of the Commissioners of the City of Rehoboth Beach. I'd like to welcome everybody here. First, we'll start off with a call to order. Commissioner Tony Sharp.
Here.
Commissioner Tim Bennett.
Here.
Commissioner Jay Legree.
Here.
Commissioner Susan Gay.
Here.
2, 3, 4, 5. Mayor Stan Mills is here. Commissioner Sharnowski is unable to join us today, and I assume Commissioner Patrick is just running late, but we do have a quorum and are able to formally conduct business. Thank you all for being here. I'm sorry, I wanted to call this meeting to order at 9:00 a.m., so I'll do that in advance of roll call. With that, I'd like to thank everybody that's watching virtually. Of course, we're continuing to meet virtually out of an abundance of caution for the COVID-19 pandemic, and we'll continue to do so in the near future, I expect. The pre-registered speakers that have signed in with us ahead of time are residents Hoyt Decker and Dave Diefendorfer. Welcome. We will call on you at the appropriate times during the meeting. I'd also like to point out, as I usually do, that support documents that are available prior to the meeting are usually embedded or linked to in the agenda. And I will review those with you all in a minute. The purpose of this special meeting is to discuss possible revisions to existing Chapter 253 trees in its entirety, including Articles 1 and Article 2. The support documents identified are somewhat rather extensive. The first bullet point there, potential meeting itineraries for conducting a tree code review, indicates the possibility of 7 meetings. This is all a guesswork. We have to see for each meeting how far we get. I would bet you that we go to possibly 10 meetings. It's all depend on how much we accomplish during each meeting. And so we'll go from there. So use that as a guide, if you would. As you can see from today's forecast on this itinerary, we're expecting only to be taking a look and discussing Article 1. And that's it. And the other article would start at our second meeting, hopefully, if we're all on schedule here. The next bullet support document is tree code review beginning February 2021. This takes you into the portal to go give you a list of all the files that are available, and there are dozens and dozens and dozens. So we wanted to get you into the portal so you could choose what to study for homework. The other support documents include a planning commission tree study that they were asked to do, a law oversight committee study that they did, a hybrid draft tree code that we'll get into today and spend a lot of our time and focus on. There's also a tree ordinance comparison chart. But first, I would like to start out with some background material, just very brief. And that is in July 1988 is when the first ordinance was adopted establishing City Parks and Shade Tree Commission and the duties and responsibilities of that group. Those responsibilities were mainly making recommendations on management of trees and shrubs in city parks and along city streets. The key word is city, on city property. Then in January 2006, 18 years later, code was amended establishing a comprehensive tree regulation chapter or article. Almost 7 years later, in December 2012, the Board of Commissioners charged the Planning Commission with studying the tree codes with 2 specific objectives. Number 1, how to best meet the city's goal to increase its tree canopy on both public and private lands. And number 2, the second objective was to assess the city's current tree ordinance adopted again almost 7 years earlier. Then come along, there was a big dormancy there. And in the fall of 2017, the Law Oversight Committee was established by the then mayor and commissioners and commenced meetings in February 2018. And then, starting in February 2021, we resumed Board of Commissioners meetings on trees with the main outcome of charging committees with review of the recommendations from the Planning Commission and the Oversight Committee. And also at that time, Commissioner Gay agreed to take the lead. And since that time, she has had many meetings with different groups to solicit their input on proposed recommendations to revise the current tree code. Now here we are 10 years later. I'd like to remind everybody that there are lots and lots of thanks to give out for a lot of dozens of volunteers that committed their time to reviewing this, including those citizens that had an interest in it, also those on the Parks and Shade Tree Commission, Law Oversight Committee, Planning Commission, Tree and Green Infrastructure Committee, and others. And Susan will hit on some of those also. Would like to remind everybody that we are a tree city. And I don't think we need to remind everybody of our commitment and desire to protect and preserve trees in the town. I think it was last April, we were announced as our 30th anniversary as a tree city. I do want to say before we begin that this has not had a legal review. I thought it would be prudent for us to throw it out there. Let's get some response from the commissioners. And then when we feel like we have a path forward, then task Glenn with doing a legal review of it. And that's when he can start billable hours on that. When we, for the easiest thing for us and the public following us, when we have references, if we would reference the documents such as the Planning Commission report or the Law Oversight report or the hybrid report, identify the document, but also identify the line number or page number, so that, and give us a little pause so we can bring that up and do that. With that, I'm going to hand it over to Commissioner Gay. And again, applaud her. She has done a phenomenal amount of work on this, talking with the different agencies, organizations, different people to come up. And it was her desire to come up with the hybrid proposal, as well as a comparison chart that she's going to share with us. So Susan, take it away.
Okay, thank you very much for that intro, Mayor. And I'm going to spend just a few minutes with an intro of my own before we get into it. I promise it'll just be like 4 or 5 minutes, just to sort of set the stage for how we got to where we are today. As the mayor mentioned, the revision of the current tree code actually began 9 years ago, and a little over 9 years ago in December 2012, when the Planning Commission a resolution was adopted to give them the assignment of revising it. They took 2 years to come up with a new draft ordinance, but nothing was done with it at all over some years. And then with a change of administration in 2017, the Law Oversight Committee was formed for the purpose of relooking at the current tree ordinance. They too took 2 years to produce a draft ordinance. And that came to the commissioners sometime in 2020. And starting in February 2021, so just 1 year ago, we came together to review all of these as part of an overall review of the tree code. So that's really when the commissioners' work on the tree code began. And since we have 2 commissioners here today that weren't part of the group last February, and because we have members of the public listening who may not have been aware of our meetings last February and March, I'm just going to go briefly over what was accomplished there in preparation for today. At the very first meeting, the mayor gave, on February 23rd, the mayor gave an extensive overview of all the documentation relating to the revisions of the tree code and all the feedback over that 9 years. And the city created in a section of the document center specifically on trees that contains all this information. So if anyone wants to see it today, it's still there, and it grows every day as we get feedback, but there's a very extensive section in the document center in the portal on trees. At that meeting, the mayor asked me to serve as liaison for this project and gave me several specific assignments. One of them was to receive feedback, as he said, from city committees and departments. Another task was to identify any new elements desired by the city staff. Also identify areas not sufficiently covered in either the current code or either of the proposed revisions. But also to identify what is particularly good about the new proposed codes. And finally, to analyze feedback. Well, it's a tall order, and it continues to be a challenge today. But what you have before you today is the product of that effort. And some questions remain, there's no question about it. The hybrid draft is a compilation of all the previous work that's been done. And I have to say, it's all good stuff. You know, none of those efforts were wasted. They've all gone into making what will be our final ordinance. But because it's a compilation of previous work, it was impossible to redline either our current draft or either of the previous ordinances. And actually, the Law Oversight Committee had the same problem. They had found it impossible to redline the current ordinance, and so they produced a new draft. Same thing here. But because of that, I created a chart that just as a sort of a quick reference to some of the issues that we still need to solve, to compare the current ordinance with each of the previous revisions and then what's on the hybrid. That's not meant to take the place, obviously, of the ordinance. We still need to go over the individual clauses within it, but it's meant to be a quick reference as to some of the issues. And I'll just say as a caveat that as with any compilation, there may be inconsistencies, there may be details that need to be refined. And as the mayor mentioned, it has not yet been through legal review because he wants to get a consensus from us first. So as I mentioned, the Law Oversight Committee spent 2 years on it, Planning Commission spent 2 years on it, but it's been 9 years. So recognizing that some of that time has been spent waiting for feedback, waiting for it to be a priority to come to the commissioners, I would like us to take decisive action to adopt a new tree code in the very near future through a short series of meetings. And that is my sincere hope. But today, we are only talking about Article 1, the Parks and Shade Tree Commission role and the care of public trees. And you'll see that one of the support documents is a sort of an itinerary breaking down, what we would discuss at the various meetings. And the mayor asked me for that last week. And what I used as sort of inspiration for coming up with that schedule is the way the city manager is currently doing our budget, where we're talking about individual sections at each of our meetings, and also the way the Planning Commission consultant has organized the discussions of the CDP by taking it chapter by chapter. So that's the same approach I'm using here, is start at the beginning. And I thought maybe if we just did Article 1 today, then we can get into Article 2. So if you're tuning in to see what the answers are going to be for trees on your own property, you're not going to get that answer today, but we're getting there. And I think the next meeting will be in just a couple of weeks. So that's my intro on how we got to where we are today. A couple of other things. First of all, why do we have a tree ordinance? Well, tree ordinances are among the tools used by communities to attain a healthy and well-managed urban forest. They provide authorizations and standards for management activities. And more importantly, we're required to have a tree ordinance as part of our standing as a Tree City USA. And as the mayor mentioned, we've been a tree city for 30 years, and the first tree ordinance was written in preparation for becoming a tree city it was written in 1988. And also, as he said, that version only dealt with city trees. That is what Article 1 is only dealt with city trees. Private property ordinance did not come along until 2006, but both are important, which is why this hybrid draft still contains them as separate articles. Because it's especially important nowadays, I think, as we'll see when we go through it, to show the public how the city intends to manage its most important asset, that it's not just on private property. We find we're losing more trees on private property, but the city has to step up and make sure that we maintain the city trees as well. The goals of the tree ordinance are simply to maintain and increase the city's tree canopy. And we reached a consensus in March of 9 objectives for the tree ordinance. And I'm gonna share one quick slide. I pulled out 4 of them that I think are particularly relevant for today. Well, as we go through the whole ordinance, we'll eventually get to all of them. But since we're only talking about public trees today, I wanted to share the objectives that relate to that section. And they are in front of you. The first is to establish responsibility. We reached a consensus. I don't know that we had a formal vote, but at our meeting on March 23rd, we reached a consensus about these objectives. To establish responsibility for developing a comprehensive urban forest plan with particular attention on the distinct needs and attributes of different neighborhoods. To preserve, protect, and conserve the abundant trees in the city. To maintain and increase the city's tree canopy on both private and public land, and to establish a comprehensive planting list of recommended native species as well as a list of invasive species using the state of Delaware forest list as a guide. So with those objectives as background, I guess what I would like to do now, and I'm going to stop sharing. I have one other slide to show, but it's related to something, another topic. Then I suppose what we should do is get right into going through the sections of Article 1. Mayor, how do you want to proceed with that?
As tedious as it is, we should just start at the top and work our way down.
Okay.
And as we get to any of the titled tabs on your comparison chart, then we pause and should do a comparison. It would be helpful for us as we move along to recognize that if anybody's silent, then that kind of indicates a concurrence with what's being put into the hybrid proposal. So if you're complicit with it, then remain silent or say so, but preferred that you speak up. And if you don't know, then that would be certainly something to identify also, that you're perplexed about which way to go on this and why. So Susan, go ahead.
Okay, and I'll just also say at the start that I'm going to work from the draft ordinance, but I also have the chart. Not all, I am going to go through each clause, even though not all these sections are in the chart, because I mostly included things there that we still had issues with or where there had been changes. So some things there were no changes, so they're not necessarily in the chart. But in that case, they should also be easy to get through. In terms of the definitions, and by the way, I have noticed a couple of mistakes in cross-reference numbering. On line 13, where we've added a note that there's a definition for city arborist, which is actually in the second part of the code. Those definitions are 253.22, not 253.24. I just noticed that yesterday. Our current code had definitions for park and street trees. And this definition is quite similar. It's not exactly the same as those. The reason being that those definitions actually included shrubs and bushes and other woody vegetation. But shrubs and bushes and other woody vegetation are not trees. So we changed the definition to focus on what are park trees, what are street trees. So that's fairly straightforward. Then,
Susan, can I just interject something? I know I've mentioned in the past, and others have mentioned in the past, the desire to have a red line version.
Yep.
And I know the Law Oversight Committee resisted that, and I think rightfully so. And I think maybe you have too, that it is just way, way, way too difficult to do a red line version. This is so extensive that I think it's on each of us to just read the current code, read the other reports, and do a comparison to the hybrid. So I just wanted to mention that.
Yeah, and that's why I was going to explain too, because in some cases it's, may not be necessary, or it may just, be fairly straightforward like this definition thing. So that's.
Well, this is very helpful because it's very obvious city arborist was something new and added, but some of us might not have seen that the definitions of park trees and street trees might have changed.
Right, yeah. Just mostly clean up on that. Now, interestingly, the next one, the creation of the commission and membership, there is a change there, and it was one proposed in the law oversight draft and one that I heartily support, and that is that as it currently stands, and many of you may not realize this, the members of the Parks and Shade Tree Commission have to be residents of the city, full-time residents. But this code changes that such that they can be residents or property owners. So in other words, sort of like the planning commission as opposed to the board of adjustment that has to be only residents. And I guess that's by state mandate. So we can't change that, but we have it the right. I assume we can change, Glenn, this Parks and Shade Tree Commission to include non-resident property owners, right?
Yep, no problem. The only thing I'd mention is I see that stylistically, I usually capitalize the word city. I'm not sure throughout this code whether it's capitalized or not, but I typically like to capitalize it where it speaks of the city of Rehoboth Beach. So
yeah, you know, I usually do as well. That's one of those cleanup things we need to do.
good. Yeah, but yeah, the membership can be property owners or residents.
Okay. And anybody have any feedback on that?
Again, if you, while we go through this, if you follow along in your comparison draft, you'll have the comparison to the PC report, law oversight report, and the comparison to what's current and what's proposed. So I'm fine with amending it so that residents or property owners can be members. Any other feedback? No, there seems to be the silence is concurrence. Thank you. And it's quicker too, by golly.
Right.
Okay, so that sounds like a given and a little check mark by there. Thank you, Susan. Go ahead.
It'll allow more people to serve, and so that I think that's great. The next two, actually 253.3 and 4, term of office and compensation, have not changed at all. That's just been picked up from the current ordinance. I didn't even put them on the chart because there's no change there. But when you get down to 253.5 on the duties and responsibilities of the commission, and actually that entire paragraph is not reflected on the chart. One element that I want to discuss is reflected on the chart. But let me just say that the first part of that, where it says the commission shall hear and decide appeals for affected parties, may authorize a variance from this ordinance where, owing to special conditions, an interpretation of the chapter will result in unnecessary hardship. That phrasing came from the law oversight draft because in the original tree code, the one we have now, those duties weren't there because there was no private property ordinance when that part of the code was written. So when the first code was written, the Parks and Trade Trees only duty was to study and investigate and have a written plan for the care of trees, which I don't think they were really ever tasked with, but that was in the original code. So, and that's really what we have to make a decision about, because I have carried over that duty that they'll provide an annual report. And yet in discussions with the committees, and I know law oversight thought that the Parks and Shade Tree should not necessarily be the ones to do this task, that it should fall to the city arborist. But I have another piece I want to add that's not reflected here because it wasn't in any of the drafts, and that is that I firmly believe that we need a comprehensive urban forest plan. It was in the CDP in 2010, and it's in the new CDP as well. So it's an unrealized goal of the CDP to have a comprehensive urban forest plan. And I know that Liz has a draft of one. And I'm not saying we should hold up passing the tree ordinance until we have one, but I think it should be stated in the code that we have one. And secondly, that way, if there's an annual report from it showing what we've accomplished, it makes it easier to do that, and it makes it more meaningful. So I would like to add wording, saying that we will have such a plan.
Susan, I would say at some point in the near future, we might invite Liz to come and actually explain what are the components of a comprehensive urban forest plan so that we have a greater understanding. So
Well, she's here now if we want to ask her.
no, I
You don't? Okay.
I don't want to put her on the spot, I guess. Yeah, that maybe she would even have something to show us possibly. So,
Okay,
so
yeah,
you're all,
in drafts over time. I mean, it's, it's a start, and I know it's a lot of work, and we talked about, how to go about doing it. And of course, our committee stands ready to help if in whatever way we can as well. But I think it would be an important thing to have going forward, because we have so much. I think we have a lot of work to do, with maintaining the tree canopy, and it would be a good start.
okay, so I've got that on the future agenda to come back to that.
Okay.
You want to get some feedback from the commissioners on who actually does the report?
I think so. And in other words, I think we need to decide whether we're going to have it in here that the Parks and Shade Tree will have an annual report, that the arborist will. If the arborist is going to do an annual report, then it probably does not need to be in this section, because this section is about duties of the commission.
All right, I've got Commissioner Gossett and then Commissioner Sharp. Commissioner Gossett?
Yes, thank you. Just quickly, I do believe that we should have an urban forest plan put together, and the report should be based on the accomplishments or goals outlined in that urban forest plan. I don't know, if Ms. Lingo is her duties would require to develop that urban forest plan, but certainly I believe she's the one with the information and is out in the city every day and what have you. So she would be instrumental in helping to design and implement that plan. So perhaps it's a joint effort between the commission and the city arborist to do an annual report based on, though, our goals and aspirations outlined in the urban forest plan. Thank you.
Sharp?
I will just, rather than repeat, I will just concur with exactly what Commissioner Gossett just stated.
Thank you.
Okay, and Mayor, perhaps this is an opportunity for me to share the second slide, because it has some important statistics in it about the tree canopy as a whole on public property. So hold on a minute. It's only one, I promise. Okay, get down here. Okay, first of all, this information came, a tiny bit of background here too. In February of 2019, Commissioner Sharp, who was then chair of the Mayor's Advisory Committee on Trees, gave a very compelling presentation to the commissioners at a workshop on green infrastructure and the importance of green infrastructure to the city. And in fact, at the end of that meeting, it got an agreement from the commissioners that all city projects would include a component of green infrastructure. And in preparing that presentation, our committee asked Liz for some data on the trees that are removed from private property and how many are replaced, and trees on city property. And this is the information we got. Now, of course, today, this information is a little bit dated, and I would love to get an update. I've talked to Liz about it. I get the sense the new system may not make getting this data as easy to get hold of. But I'd like to think that we could get some sort of sense going forward as well. And this would be a component perhaps of an annual report. But, at first glance, the city's doing a great job of replacement. There you go. You see, we plant 2.6, or did a few years ago, 2.6 for every tree removed. But on private property, that's not happening, and it's not practical in many places. So the burden is really on the city to replace the canopy based on this. Now, I'll also say that good news of the 260 is a bit misleading as a percentage, because if you look at the raw numbers, 260%, the math issue on that 110 trees is 260%. That means only 42 came out. So only 42 were removed, whereas you can see on private property, many times more than that are removed. So we're still losing a lot, but citywide. The other thing that's not reflected here is that it's drastically varied all over the city. You know, some neighborhoods are very treed and others are not, like Country Club where I live. So so this is the kind of thing I think that would be in an urban forest plan, is how we go about maintaining our forests and what is happening on a daily basis, and how we manage them. So what do we want to put in here for the annual report? Do we want to say, and I will say, by the way, that several members of the Parks and Shade Tree Commission have asked for an annual report, have said that they thought it would be useful to once a year look at the permits that have been issued and that sort of thing. Comments?
So Susan, could you restate exactly what your current question is?
In the code now is, and in the draft, and I guess that was picked up from the Planning Commission's draft because it's not in the law oversight draft, is that the commission shall provide an annual report based on the number of property owners, builders that were granted or denied a tree removal permit and the rationale, the tree removal permits granted and denied, a list, and the trees replaced in their locations.
This is the hybrid report lines 44, 45, 46.
Right. And the question is whether that remains as a task of the Parks and Shade Tree Commission, or if it's removed from here and becomes a task for the arborist, which would not necessarily be part of the code, I guess. I don't know whether we would put it in the code or not in that case.
Well, it's just my opinion, obviously, but it seems very logical to me that the responsibility for the report would be led and possibly created by the city arborist.
Yeah, I agree with that.
Yeah, I agree. I agree too.
I see Jay's hand up.
Yeah.
Commissioner Legree, go ahead.
Thank you. The comprehensive urban forest plan will have goals and objectives, and I think our report should address those goals and objectives. And it's more than just numbers. It's more than just permits. It's how we may decide that we have need different numbers for trees, or a lot of different things can go into reaching our goal of a well-functioning urban forest management plan. And I think our report should address that. So it should be more than just numbers, more than just permits, more than just locations. Should be address the whole plan. And I'm just repeating myself. Thanks, Susan.
Okay, yeah, I agree. I mean, so the question is, what do we put here? If the annual report as well as the plan are going to come from the arborist, what goes in the code? Nothing, or do we insert a paragraph? I don't have to do it today. I just make a note that we need to insert a paragraph saying what the arborist duties are.
Commissioner, can I make a comment?
Please do.
Sorry, this is Liz. My suggestion would be to kind of go along with what Commissioner Legree and Gossett said, that it's a little bit broader than just numbers. That does form a basis. That's how we benchmark, right, and monitor progress. But maybe we can add a statement calling it a report on the status of the urban forest to include information such as permit numbers, appeal numbers and outcomes, because that would be an important piece of information to get from the commission as well. And that way it can be as broad or as specific as it's a report for the mayor and commissioner. So it can be whatever you all want it to be.
Okay.
That's fine. I agree with that. But Susan, your question, it has to do with 253-5.
Right.
That this is contained within duties and responsibilities of the commission. So if we concur with that, then it needs to be pulled out of there. And the question is, do we find another niche in the code to put it.
Or do we just deal with it outside the code? Since it's.
It's
a duty
Commissioner
of-
Gossett here. I think it needs to be a part of the code so it's not overlooked for in the future, that people are not as familiar with the code. Perhaps some of that, I haven't read the definition of the city arborist, but perhaps that could be part of the duties and responsibilities of the city arborist, and also then reflected in the duties and responsibilities of the commission.
Okay, then let me work on putting something in. And maybe, maybe we could do a little bit of both, have it be part of the definition for the arborist, but also perhaps have a separate clause in here that basically speaks to the comprehensive urban forest plan and says that the arborist will prepare it, but that in concert with the Parks and Shade Tree will review it annually or something like that. And just add a clause. Section.
I think that would be fine.
Okay. All right. Anything else on that one, Mayor?
Just the aspect of this, Gossett again here. One of the things, though, as you're designing or defining this, is just to determine what data can be captured from the city, or do we have to develop a new recording system or something of that nature to get the actual data that's required to meet our goals. So in going forward.
Okay. Great. And I like Liz's idea too of including basically the status of the earth, so that as Jay says, we're looking beyond the numbers into the status of what we've actually done.
I agree with you also, Gossett, here again. It reflects that we have a greater planting on city property, but is that a reflection of the mitigation from private property onto planting on city property because people don't have any room left on their own private property plant trees?
Right. Okay. Mayor, am I ready to move on to the next one?
Yeah, let me go to Jay first, but let me have a note here for the public, how we want to handle the public. Rather than going to the public for each single item of the article, there are 18 sections here. I think I'll divide them into thirds so that we can give the members of the public opportunity 3 times to get in there and comment on what we're talking about. Commissioner Legree.
Yeah, as the year goes on, the city arborist is going to see areas where she may decide that one thing's more important than something else, and she may want to emphasize one. We need to give her quite a bit of latitude and to go forward and make those decisions about how well we're meeting the goals and objectives of the comprehensive plan. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, Susan, go ahead.
So I take it if you're dividing it into thirds for comment that we'll stop after the next one, 6.
Yeah, that'll be fine.
Okay, right, okay. So the next one on species to be planted is also very straightforward. First of all, the current code actually includes a list, a very specific list of trees. And we wanted to get away from that because that might change over time and have the list kind of be separate from the code. So the code then would only specify trees that are native. And actually I want to correct an inconsistency there. Elsewhere in the code, we changed native to Delaware to native to the mid-Atlantic. This was in concert with Liz and with my tree committee. And that wording was never picked up in this clause. So it should say trees planted as park trees and as street trees shall be species native to the mid-Atlantic as classified by the Delaware Forest Service, or another species approved by the city arborist. And this is again where we give her the authority and her the leeway to say what works best. So we don't want to specify specific trees and tie her hand that way. So that's the change from the current code, but it is consistent with every previous revision that's been done in the last 9 years.
I think that's fine. I did not make a list, but as I went through the entirety of the code, there seemed to be many references to lists and different type of lists. So I think we need to review that. In terms of 253-6, are there any further questions? Commissioner Bennett?
Yes, without without having a list, does it open us up to interpretation that will change from time to time? I'm thinking back to the most recent one with the ginkgo tree, as to whether that was, female, male, all that sort of thing. So if there is a list, I don't see what the issue, what would be wrong with including it, or at least having it referenced, just to take away any ambiguity.
Personally, I like lists with a caveat at the end that says, and others as approved by the city arborist. I think it makes it so much easier for the lay person to just go in there and instantly determine what may or may not be permissible.
Liz, do you want to speak to that? We have a list now. There's a separate little card that has, and I think it's different from what's in the code. That's how it's changed over time. And so I guess the issue was just, did we put all that in the code and then have to go in and change the code every year? Or do we refer to one or include by reference the most current list from the city? I guess I'll ask Lynn and Liz how to do that.
So we do currently, right now we have two separate lists in the current code. So in Article 1, there is a list of trees that can be planted as street trees, and it is horribly outdated and includes invasive species. So to be honest, we really haven't gone by that. But keep in mind that the street trees being planted are by the city. Mm-hmm. So we ultimately have control over what trees get planted along our streets and in our parks. And as street trees, a lot of them are non-natives. And then, we can think of some trees such as a London plane. That is synonymous with street tree, right? Mm-hmm. Well, that's not a native tree.
Right.
It's a replacement for a native because it does better. Same with an American elm. You don't plant those, you plant the Chinese elm now. Mm-hmm. So there does have to be some latitude when you have a list. And the other list you're talking about that's on the card is trees for planting on private property for mitigation and minimum density. And that is referenced in the code in the second article, but it's not, the individual species aren't listed. It just has a list of native species provided by the city. And those type of things do change over time. They come out with, and this is probably something we'll need to decide in the code, is how we feel. People in the industry call them nativars, which is cultivars of the native species. So you can take a pin oak, which is a 60-foot plus tall tree, and make it into a cultivar that's 15 feet wide and 30 feet tall. So are we allowing people to plant those? Are we excluding them? I think it's better the way it's written in the draft, where we would still develop a list, but have the ability to change it as things come to light. What I do currently is, and it's easier if it's not in the code for the sake of changing it, yes, but the more lines and pages in the code, the harder it is to find things when you're looking, right? So if we can take a list of trees to be planted and just have it as a PDF, mm-hmm. When people need to plant a tree, I just email it to them. It's on the city's website. It's at the building and licensing front desk with a nice pamphlet. But it just takes a little bit of that clutter and scrolling out of the code, because as well as probably you guys know the code and I know the code, I still find myself scrolling through it. So
as long as there's a list, I can be happy. Optimally, if the code indicated see arborist for list or something, so that anybody reading it can find it. But having a list, I think, is very valuable. Commissioner Sharp?
I'm sorry, I jumped the gun. Maybe I'm misreading this, but I thought we were on the section that these are only park trees and street trees.
They are.
So the city arborist is in complete control of that. Mm-hmm. So I'm not sure where the discussion is going regarding lists and so forth on these 4 lines of Article 1.
But Commissioner Bennett brought it up because of the appeal that we had that was for a street tree, and that's why I brought it up. And so that does happen sometime, even though I agree that it should be under it should be the decision of the arborist, but he was just asking if we should. include
Okay.
that.
Well, it might be good to memorialize it anyhow, because we do allow the citizenry, the members of the public, to plant trees, street trees. And so we need to maybe give them parameters and include that in the list. Commissioner Sharp, are you done?
Well, since you said that, Mayor, I was not aware that we allow private citizens to populate street trees and parks. Can you maybe share a little more on that?
Well, so it's somewhere in this hybrid code that articulates that they are allowed to do it. And that is current, I believe. So that's
Yes,
not
it
new.
is current, absolutely.
So we will get to that at a later date, Commissioner, and talk about it.
Okay.
Because it's interesting. My recollection's fuzzy, but we allow it. We also indicate, for instance, that if it becomes a nuisance tree, the city has the authority to take it down and charge that property owner that planted it.
We're going to
So,
be getting to that.
so this is kind of a big deal, if you will. And I think it's very important to have clear parameters available to the public, because a lot of the public, they love their trees and they can't put it in the front yard or something. They want to put a street tree in, but there needs to be those rules that govern who plants it, where it's planted, what the care is, and who maintains it. So that'll be coming up at some point in the future. That would be possibly at next meeting, Susan.
No, it's part of this section.
Okay.
Yeah, it's probably it'll be the most time consuming part of our discussion of this section, I think.
Okay, so stay tuned, if you will, and we'll get back to that. Commissioner Bennett, and then Commissioner Gossett.
Yes, I was just to Commissioner Sharp's point, and I guess this may be for Ms. Lingo. I guess my point of having a list was just so that there was consistency, whether the city was planting or a private citizen was. And I guess so, as I heard the city arborist say, can the city plant trees differently than what we allow private citizens to plant? In other words, types of species. And if so, I think we would be smart to make sure the list was the same for both parties. That would be my opinion.
Commissioner Bennett has a question out there for Glenn and Liz. Can the city choose to, if there's a list of appropriate street trees, can we abandon that and put in what we want?
So I can weigh in, Mayor. I see this in some ways, the way zoning laws are treated, in that the city, so long as it's exercising a municipal purpose, does not have to comply with zoning laws. We in the city of Rehoboth Beach, I always say we try to comply with the zoning laws that have been established. And I think it probably makes sense here to try to comply with whatever we require of private property owners. But I think that there's a strong argument that the city would not need to comply unless you specifically say within this code, the city shall comply with this list. I mean, I kind of like the idea that Liz should have a little bit of flexibility, I think, as it relates to city or public property.
Thank you, Glenn. Anything else, Commissioner Bennett? Thank you. Commissioner Gossett?
Yes, question really is for Mr. Mandalis. With regards to the list, is that necessary to make it as an appendix to the code, or how it is it best to identify the lists and annually update or something of that nature?
So I think you can do it pretty much however you want to within the code. I see, Liz said that these lists change from time to time, and she might recognize different species, or whoever the city arborist happens to be, might recognize species that make sense for the city that maybe didn't make sense 10 years earlier, or species that maybe no longer make sense. So I think that probably giving the city arborist some authority to establish the list and have it on file and available, rather than naming every tree within the code and then having to revise and amend the code every time the arborist makes a recommendation, I think is maybe the better approach here. But there's no requirement, Commissioner, that the list be contained within the code, so long as you reference it and give the authority to the city arborist to establish and maintain the list.
Thank you, Glenn. Anybody else?
I mean, I'll just add to that, for what it's worth, the wording is the same. When we get to Article 2, you'll see that the word on the species to be planted, we picked up the identical language for private property as well, that it'll be species native to the Mid-Atlantic or another species approved by the city arborist. Because as I said before, we want to give her the leeway and the authority to approve not only what the city can do, but what she's going to do in the city, and for what private property owners can do on their lot as well. So it's meant to be the same.
All right. So do you have marching orders here, Susan?
I think so. Yeah, I think we're
Oh.
yeah, I think we're leaving this one as it is here with a list to be provided separately.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay.
That's what I'm hearing. Commissioner Bennett, your hand's still up. Do you have anything? You're good. Okay. With that, let's take a pause and go to members of the public. First, we'll go to Hoyt Decker, and then we'll go to Dave Diefendorfer. I'd like to remind everybody, our members of the public, that we are focused only on Article 1 and prefer that your comments be relative to Article 1, Section 253-1 through 253-6. So it's relevant to our recent conversations. Mr. Decker, are you there?
Oh, I actually don't see him. He was there earlier.
All right, we'll see if he comes back. With that, Dave Diefendorfer, we know that your wife, Carolyn, has a piece of correspondence that we received, and it contains a couple references to Article 1 sections, as well as those beyond Article 1. Do you have any comments so far on what we've talked about up to Section 253-6? Dave? You're muted, Dave.
All right, thank you. Tragically, I did not realize this was just for, this meeting was just for Article 1. So I have some comments about Article 2, so I'll just hold them until your next meeting, and you don't need to call on me anymore. Thank you.
All right, very good. You change your mind, try to speak up and sneak in there. Thank you, Dave. With that, Commissioner Bennett, your hand's still up. Yes or no? Okay, there you go. There you go. Very good. Susan, we'll go on to the next item, which also 253-7 is also on your comparative chart. Go ahead.
This is interesting. Actually, the change that was made here was simply to have the same dimensions for the standard of the size tree to be planted on city property as we require on private property, which is 2 inches of a DBH and 8 to 10 feet in height. For some reason, the current code has 1 1/4 to 1 1/2. And actually, Liz, this is where I'm going to need your help. I noticed these inconsistencies throughout this. Please explain to me again whether we should be using caliper or DBH here, because I see it written both ways.
Yeah, that would be helpful, because the Law Oversight Committee, by example, I think uses caliper, and then we use what is it, diameter breast height.
Actually, they use DBH too for some of theirs. But anyway, I'll just ask Liz, because it may be different for different parts. But what should be used here in terms of the height the diameter at which something is planted?
Sure. So when we're talking about newly planted trees or small trees in the landscape, it's generally by caliper.
Okay.
When we're talking about larger trees established in the landscape, then it's DBH.
Okay.
Well, Liz, can you define what each means? I think caliper is a 12-inch dimension, and DBH is 4 foot 6 inches, correct?
It depends. DBH is always 4.5 feet. Yes. The definition of caliper can change according to the size of the tree.
Okay.
So and when you buy them from a nursery, they have them in ranges. So you call and you'll ask for a 2 to 2.5 inch red bud. So it might be 2 inches, it might be 2.5. So if we use 2, it always covers everything. And right now the code has everything measured at a foot.
At the 12-inch, as if
Yeah.
it were complying with the definition of caliper.
Yeah, I actually did it wrong for a little bit when I first started working here, because for 8 years I measured trees at shoulder height, and then all of a sudden I was having to bend down and measure 20-inch maples where the root flare hadn't even turned into a trunk. So
Right.
but I can send Commissioner Gay the actual technical definition, and we can decide if we want to use them or maybe simplify it a little. Because I believe what it is once a tree gets up to 6 inches, then it's measured at a foot. But once it's below that, then it's measured at 6 inches. 6 inches. So in the nursery, a lot of times it's measured at 6. So, and honestly, that may vary a little from nursery to nursery too. And so, but I can send them to her, and you guys can discuss and decide at a later date for sake of simplicity.
So, but for our line
I
61.
think that would be good. And if you have any, I'm a fan of illustrations. If you have an illustration of caliper and DBH to accompany that would be wonderful. So,
Well, Mayor, they have so many, even with DBH, it's not as simple. There are different, like ISA may measure it different than the Forest Service, and where they're on slopes, have multiple trunks. I mean, it gets to be where there's multiple pages of how to just measure something so simple. So at some point we have to make it easy enough for the public to understand, right?
Yeah, and for purposes of this clause, you want to say caliper. So on line 61, rather than breast height DBH, you want to say caliper. Okay, I've made that change.
Yeah, I mean, fortunately, if you measure a nursery tree at DBH, it's probably not, they mainly have real straight trunks, so it's probably not that different than a half a foot off the ground anyways. So,
yeah. Okay.
But yeah, we should get everything correct technically when we're doing this.
All right. Thank you.
Commissioner Gay, on line 61, it mentions be at least 2 inches in diameter. You're going to change it to caliper.
Caliper, right.
Caliper. And continuing there, it says at least 8 to 10 feet in height when planted. I notice several places in here, it says 8 to 10 feet. It gives you that range. But other places in here, it says at least 8 feet. I'm for simplicity and wordsmithing. I would say we just go at least 8 feet. Because what are we going to do? If somebody plants something 10 foot 6 inches, we're going to violate them.
Right. Right.
Yeah, that's not going to happen. So
Yeah.
I would say just clear that up.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, it's a good change. And
Well,
the only,
Commissioner, let me interrupt for a second. The reason it says 8 to 10, once again, is that's because that's how you order a multi-stem or an evergreen from the nursery will be in height ranges. So 8 to 10, 5 to 6, 7 to 8, 8 to 10, 10 to 12. So we can say a minimum of 8. It doesn't matter either way, but I think that's how that verbiage got there. So if you're a homeowner and you're calling the nursery and you say, I'm looking for a tree at least 2 inches caliper and 8 to 10 feet in height, they can pull that list up. They don't have to explain to you, well, do you want it 7 to 8 or 8 to 10?
yeah, that's a good point.
I don't know if it makes a difference for the code, but
I still say we aim for the lay person and at least 8 feet. Again, if we're going to do that, then we need to be consistent throughout the code because it's both back and forth. So pick one and do it. But I would suggest we just say at least 8 feet.
Okay.
Anybody agree or disagree? I got a couple thumbs up. That's
the only other thing I'll say about this one is we actually skipped over number A, where it says this at line 59, the spacing of street trees will be approved by the city arborist. Again, that's one of those things that gives her the authority and her the latitude. In the current code, there are specific spacings mentioned for small trees, medium trees, large trees. And, even the Planning Commission draft in 2014 took that out and gave the authority to the arborist, I think just for flexibility. And so that's been maintained since then, and I just picked it up from there.
Well, it's new, giving discretion to the city arborist.
Correct.
I think that's appropriate.
Okay. Now there are a couple of easy ones. 8 and 9 are picked up directly. It haven't changed at all from the current code or any of the revisions. So 8 and 9 are as is. I don't know if anybody has any comments about either one of those. And I will say 10 was picked up as well.
Commissioner Gossett here, just have a
Yeah.
couple of questions, and maybe this addresses to Liz more. So the distance from curbs and sidewalks, we have large sections of the city without sidewalks. Do we need to address that at all?
What I do now is I take the edge of the road as the kind of the curb line, so to speak. And that way we can still establish that 30-foot triangle.
So should that be added to the code to make it easier for you to implement?
It's never been a problem. If you guys feel that the code would benefit from adding it, that's fine with me, but I've not had any issues with the way it's currently written.
Well, it does indicate between curb or curb line. So for me, curb line is that section of the where the grass or dirt intersects with the street without a curb. So I'm fine with the way it's written. I do have a question though. I believe there should be more specificity, and that line 65 should say all street trees, because what we're talking about is trees planted as park trees and street trees in 253-6. And then we're getting into street trees, but do we need to indicate street trees? Because obviously,
Yeah, that's a good point. Because yeah, that's better definition.
Just for more clarity.
Okay. Because and line 68 already says street tree, so that'll make it consistent with that.
Good. Susan, we got that. Commissioner Legree.
Okay.
Yeah, I also agree. If someone comes along tomorrow and puts in curbs and sidewalk, we want that tree to be in the right place. So if the things we know are the edge of the street and the property line, and we can measure from each one if we wanted to. So yeah, thanks, Mayor.
Thank you. Commissioner Gossett.
Yes, thank you. Just a question on number 9 there, distance from street corners and fire plugs. Do we need to address at all street ends at the beach? And also, are there any specific types of trees that are needed specifically for beach ends with regards, I know there's insurance costs and all that type of thing. That was the discussion at the Law Oversight Committee for a while. Do we need to address that at all, or is it addressed elsewhere in the code?
I don't know that it's addressed elsewhere.
I think there's a section of the code that addresses trees in the first block. Liz, do you recall?
Yes, in the draft here we're looking at, it talks about private property trees, but it does not mention the street ends at all, which would be public property. And some of them do have trees. Some of them, there's some Hollywood junipers, we have some pines. So it's definitely worth considering.
So you mean adding a section to specifically address trees at the ends? Would it be a new section?
Well, I'm not even sure about, do we want trees on the street ends? I personally think that's, and this is coming from the person who loves trees, I personally think that's a no. But, you know, I don't think we need to go in and cut down every tree that exists on a street end either, so.
I would agree. I think this is just trying to look forward in the sense of, you know, what the vision for the next 10 to 20 years of street ends. And I know, again, the Planning Commission and also the Law Oversight had strong opinions about insurance companies issuing insurance for homes close to the beach with regards to large trees, et cetera.
Do we want to say that no new trees will be planted at street ends? I mean, is part of it?
I don't know. I mean, that's under the city's control completely. So do we want to really pigeonhole ourselves in there? I'm not sure. I can tell you, and representing the city, have no plans to plant any trees on any of the street ends. I will say that, but you know, that doesn't mean plans can't change or somebody else couldn't be city arborist to decide it was their goal.
Right.
I think we can leave it alone. I'm comfortable with that. We have very few instances of trees planted at street ends. End of Newcastle is, by example, is one area, but that's a very large area from the boardwalk to the end of the street. And it's just a unique situation. So again, I think I would be comfortable just leaving it alone and at the discretion of the city.
Okay.
A couple nodded heads there. Go ahead, Susan.
And the next one also has not changed from the current code for on utilities. And I have to hope we do this, that we don't plant under or within 10 lateral feet of an overhead utility or within 5 lateral feet of an underground line. And that's just, that has not changed from any of the codes.
Well, considering the streetscape project and our desire to underground, this gives me a little pause, frankly, without saying, giving us a caveat that could it indeed be closer than the dimensions restricted there if there are tree root containment programs in place. I'm just afraid that, here we are, city, we try our best to adhere to the laws that we apply to everybody else. I mean, we do a good job at that. And yet we're liable to shoot ourselves in the foot if we go with this. Now, having said that, we can wait till we get that more detailed undergrounding analysis to find out, and then we change the law. But again, I think one possibility it is to have a caveat about using a containment system.
Maybe, I mean, I think most of the time 5 feet, even if we're doing, say, like a Silva cell and the utilities are all sheathed, I think you're still going to have minimum distances. Maybe it's less than 5 feet. I mean, maybe we can add a caveat in there unless with approval of the city manager, which would kind of go along with anything, any large streetscape project, anything out of the ordinary. And that way we don't have to start talking about other random exceptions when using tree root barriers or whatever it may be.
Well, I just want to throw out there that this was of interest to me, and just FYI, next time you all are in Bethany Beach on Garfield Parkway, take a look at their streetscape. Remember, it's within a year or two old. It was done by JMT. Interestingly, it's got a lot of the components of the Rehoboth Avenues and streetscape, and likely a lot of the components of what the Wilmington Baltimore streetscape will be. But interestingly, they've got their pavered sidewalks, a little more extensive than we have, for instance. And all their trees, by my recollection, on Garfield Parkway, that's their main drag, are in huge 4 and 5 foot diameter concrete planters. I mean, they're just huge. And it's an interesting concept to me. I love trees. I love them planted in the ground. But next time you're there, take a look at them, and then take a look at Rehoboth Avenue, and you see that what the circumstances are in Rehoboth Avenue. We've got tree roots buckling sidewalk, buckling soldier courses and pavers, causing a lot of problems. They're hard to walk over. They've got borders on them that people have to walk through after they park there, and there's tripping hazards. Whereas in Bethany Beach, they got these huge concrete planters that are on. There's no dirt areas on their sidewalks. It's all pavers and concrete. And the concrete planters are placed on top of it. Well, it's interesting because that kind of guarantees no tripping hazards, no problems with undergrounding wires, no problem with roots buckling and everything. So I'm just throwing that in there. So,
Yeah.
Commissioner Legree?
Yeah, I'm a big fan of undergrounding. We all know that. Let's leave ourselves latitude. Let's not get ourselves confined. I'm with the mayor, because we don't know what's going to happen in another 10 years, 15 years. We just don't know. I know it's going automatic. There'll be a lot of this is done without ever digging a hole, but let's leave ourselves room to be flexible. Thanks.
Thank
So
you.
is the wording of unless otherwise approved by the city manager sufficient, or do you want to do something else with the 5 feet?
I would take that out, and I would leave the put some wording in there that gives us latitude for the city manager to decide whatever method would be appropriate, or whatever
Okay.
rules would be appropriate, and that would let us use confinement if such a thing happens, or build planners if such a thing happens. Planner could be right over the top of something, and
Okay.
yeah.
All right.
Commissioner Legree, forgive me. Commissioner Gay, I heard you asked the question, should we put in the caveat that unless the city manager gives authority? And then Commissioner Gay started off by saying no, but then the rest of his answer was you agreed with Susan, I think. Is that correct?
Yes. Are you talking to me?
Yeah.
Yeah, I agree. I think the city manager should have the latitude.
Okay.
Maybe I misunderstood
But
Susan.
we
No,
leave
you're
it
good.
in, but we leave it in and say unless approved otherwise by the city manager, rather than, and I think Jay was saying, no, he thought we ought to take it out to give her the latitude. That's the difference.
Say that again.
I thought you were saying we should take out the reference to 5 lateral feet of underground utilities.
Yes,
And
I agree.
and not address
You
it.
put something in there that says appropriate containment, or and not
Well,
have be trying to get 5 feet. I think the 5 feet's going to go way down in the future.
Right.
Considering this could be applicable outside the commercial areas, outside the commercial zones, I think I would probably just leave it alone, because I think the caveat about the city manager covers it all. So I would just leave it alone.
I can sleep either way. That's
Okay.
fine.
Well, we definitely want to have the caveat in there, no question.
Yeah.
I made a note to look at potentially adding something about containment, but
All right.
we don't need to. Okay. So moving on to maintenance, which there are probably some landmines in this one, and they aren't really covered even in the chart. So what I want to do is basically look at each paragraph, because there really are some differences here. In the first paragraph, A, that really is the same as what we have now, and the same as what what the Planning Commission's draft has, with one exception in terms of comparison to current code. And that is in line 82, a line was added in a previous revision that just says the city arborist shall procure qualified tree trimming contractors to perform necessary maintenance in accordance with the city procedures and at the direction of the city manager. That's all. That was added in a previous revision. I just picked it up from there. Otherwise, there are no changes there.
In A, okay.
A, yes.
Any questions? Oh,
Okay.
okay.
That's
Okay,
it.
go ahead.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Susan.
So in B, interestingly, the current code says that the Parks and Shade Tree Commission may remove or cause to be removed any tree in unsafe conditions, whereas the first revision that the Planning Commission did, and I believe even the law oversight, gives that authority to the city arborist to say that a street tree or a park tree has to be removed for various conditions. So, and it also goes on to say on line 89 that any tree removed from city property must be replaced. And the sense I have is that's happening. And certainly the statistics I showed earlier bear that out. And I know Liz has said she replaces any tree that's removed. But the question is, do we want to maintain it with the city arborist, which I think maybe is that how it's practiced today, Liz?
I'm not sure is how what practiced.
That the Parks and Shade Tree doesn't decide whether a city tree should come out. You do that. It's a daily part of your work, right?
Yep, that's part of
Okay.
my normal job. as it refers to the Park and Shade Tree Commission, it would be more when the public requests to remove a street
Right.
tree. So
Mhm.
basically saying it has to be replaced unless the commission says you don't have to replace it.
Right.
That's how I've always read it.
Yeah. Okay. Well, so that's the way she's currently practicing it today. So,
Okay.
okay.
You mentioned line 89, I believe, any tree removed from municipal owned property must be replaced. And I guess my question is, where is it being replaced? Does it have to go in the same location? So it's a 1-for-1 replacement? Can it be placed elsewhere, like in a park? So it's being replaced, but not in the same location. What is the intent there, do you think, Susan?
You know, that's a good question. I have to ask Liz that. I don't know whether she replaces directly in the same location trees that she takes out or not, or if they're replaced somewhere else. I thought they were replaced where they were taken out, but I may be wrong.
Well, if we're talking about Park and Shade, their rulings, they rely on my recommendation, I think, with that, and that if it's appropriate for it to go back on the street, then it goes back on the street. If it's, say, too narrow of a right of way, say it's 1.5 feet wide, then either they exempt them from replacing it or they require them to place it on private property.
Actually, I think I just answered my question in part that sometimes the Parks and Shade Tree Commission, if I recall, rules on removal of city trees at the request of a property owner because they want to put a driveway in. So obviously, if you let them remove the tree in that location for the purpose of putting a driveway in, then obviously they're not going to replace it in the same location. Duh. But I'm not sure whether we need a little more clarity there, must be replaced. Or you just leave it generic with the intent of it's wherever the arborist determines it should go.
I can tell you, we really haven't had, in 6 years, I haven't had anybody try to argue this with me. So it's not created a whole lot of problems. And generally, like if I'm taking out a tree in the park, it's generally better to move the new tree somewhere else. Now, if you're in the street, you may not have that ability, but that's my own thoughts on it.
Well, Liz, for a tree example I just gave, where the Parks and Shade Tree Commission gives authority to remove a tree that's going to block somebody's proposed driveway, who then determines where that replacement tree goes? Do you determine that? And then where does it go? Does it go on the opposite side of their driveway so that they still have a tree, street tree in front of their house, but it's relocated?
It is really situational because say they're abandoning an old curb cut on the other side from the previous home, then they might take the Park and Shade Tree might rule that the appropriate street tree as determined by the city arborist has to be replaced in the right of way adjacent to the house. If there was no curb cut and it was full of street trees, they might say, you know what, you got trees on your property, you got trees in the right of way, no requirement to replant, or they might make them put it back on their own property. So it could go any one of those 3 ways.
Well, that's interesting because you just indicated that the Parks and Shade Tree Commission has given them the right not to replace a municipal owned tree on property. So here, that action violates line number 89 then.
Well, the way the current
Unless
code
otherwise-
reads, it's unless otherwise authorized by them.
Yeah.
So it has to
Okay.
be replaced unless they say, and I mean, without pulling the statistics on it, I'd say the majority of the time the tree is replaced in some way, shape, form, or location.
Mhm.
Okay, I overlooked that.
I think that's fine.
Yeah, I don't think this is a huge problem in the current code. Not to say it shouldn't be clarified and addressed in the draft, but
Yeah, I think this is picked up from the current anyway. I mean, this isn't a change. This is has been the same all along.
Yes.
Okay.
Although I think in this draft, it kind of takes a lot of those street tree removals. It takes them off the park and shade trees plate and puts them on mine.
Yeah.
So really it would become essentially, I said, yes, it has to be replaced, and they don't want to replace it. So then they go to the park and shade.
Right.
So they wouldn't be making the initial request to the Park and Shade Tree Commission anymore. So it's slightly different.
Well, here, I don't know where this is appropriate, but I've found an interesting conundrum for me. If you have a street tree that's a memorial tree, so it's got one of those little memorials at the bottom of it, and the owner wants to remove the street tree that's a memorial tree, this gives the Parks and Shade Tree Commission the right to override that tree, if they authorize its removal, to not be replaced. And I've always had a little heartburn over that, because to me, memorial trees are somewhat dedicated to those that plant them and pay money for their initial installation and maintenance. So I don't know if there's a section of the code that indicates memorial, that is specific to memorial trees, that indicates if a memorial tree is removed, that it indeed must be replaced.
There isn't in either the current or draft code anything about the memorial trees, but I do agree with you, because people get really attached to them. And the hardest part is most of the records I have for these memorial trees, whoever paid to have it installed, that person isn't even alive anymore. And so I have a phone number to a person that's not from Rehoboth that has passed away 10, 20 years ago. So it's very, very hard to get, if there is a tree proposed for removal, it is very hard to figure out who like I've literally had to ask other residents in town, do you recognize this last name, so that I can try and I've had success in that, Rehoboth being a small town, but it's, how would you feel if all of a sudden you came back, and this has happened to people, they haven't been back for 3 years and it was removed for a city project and it's being temporarily stored, and they come back to look at their great grandfather's plaque and it's not there. And they call and, I take down their current phone number and email, but we could have the same problem in another 10, 20 years. So yeah. I tend to agree with you on that, Mayor, that they should be preserved when possible and in the same location or as near as possible.
Well, I'd like to work with Liz and maybe Susan on this. Maybe it's its own section or something. I think it's much bigger than even what we're talking about. We've got a potential streetscape project coming up with all the memorial trees there. I know for Rehoboth Avenue streetscape, we pulled them up, stored them, and put them back where we could, but it becomes problematic. So let's get together and put our heads together on that one. So we'll come back to memorial trees. Thank you, Susan.
First, I just want to say I appreciate Liz's efforts to reach the owners of the plaques or their relatives. That's really great. But it speaks to, this is exactly why in the new commemorative tree program, there's a sculpture at City Hall with leaves and names, so that we don't have this problem going forward, which I think was also Liz's idea. So hopefully that will prevent it in the future, that people don't have specific trees that they're named for.
So Susan, is line 89 clear for you?
Yeah, again, it's the way it's been, so I'm happy to leave it that way until we ask about memorial. Yeah. So okay, so for section C, this is where there needs to be some discussion. The first line, certainly the concept is not new. It just means that no citizen shall plant or spray, preserve, prune, move, or cut any tree, any street tree or municipally owned property tree without first receiving permission from the city arborist. No problem there. This is also the section where it states that it does not prohibit the planting of street trees by private property owners provided that the location and the selection of them is in accordance with the code of the provisions we've just gone over. And after that, that street tree becomes property of the city. In paragraph A of this code, it does clearly state, it shall be the responsibility, line 81, it shall be the responsibility of the city to provide adequate maintenance of all city parks and trees. So once that street tree is claimed by the city, even if it's planted by a citizen, it becomes the city's responsibility to maintain. However, and that language has been picked up in all the various revisions. However, it does say if the tree needs to be removed, the city shall have the authority to remove it and make repairs and charge the cost of repairs to the property owner. And then it cites a different code provision about sidewalks. And I know that this came up in discussion, and it even came up in discussion when the Planning Commission was doing it, because they thought, at least they said in some of their materials, that they thought the city should be responsible. And I thought that had been changed, but I had picked up this wording from their ultimate draft, and it has not been changed. No. And I don't know if that's because it's referencing another article, or whether it's just common practice that homeowners have to maintain sidewalks no matter what the reason. So
Susan, that is a very big conversation that we can certainly add to this, but I mean, it's going to add meetings, plural, to it on who has a responsibility for installing and maintaining sidewalks. And we've just never gotten to that. The chapter 232-1 referenced has to do with general sidewalk construction standards and duty of property owner to repair sidewalk, curbing, or both. So it's just kind of a generic thing on repair of sidewalk. You know, property owner gets a swimming pool put in, and they drive a drive truck over the city sidewalk and break it. Well, then that's on the property owner today. Same thing with, I think the intent here is that if you indeed plant a tree, which we are allowing you by this section of code, then you have certain responsibilities to see that if any damage from the roots is caused to the sidewalk, then the repairs are on you. The interesting caveat, if anybody has looked through it, the entirety of the code, somewhere in here leaves an exception for memorial trees. If it was a tree planted by the city and it's a memorial tree, then any damages done to the sidewalk are the responsibility of the city. And I don't know where that is in there, but I'm pointing it out so when we get to it, we keep an eye out for it.
Yeah, there's some other language in 253.14 that we're going to get to today that is somewhat contradictory here as well. So I mean, this just never got resolved. But you're saying the whole sidewalk discussion is a much bigger discussion.
Absolutely, absolutely.
So should we leave it for now that since citizens are responsible for sidewalks, generally damage to sidewalks, that we leave it in here? Because it references that part of the code.
Well, I'd say we garner any feedback from the commissioners today, and then yes, let's give it a little more thought and bring back a proposal to work from.
I mean, does it have to be if we were to say that the city would, because we're saying this, the street tree is in property of the city and the city's going to maintain it, but the city can also make repairs and charge it back. That to me seems contradictory. But so I don't know what, and I understand the reference to the sidewalk code, but I don't know whether that means an exception should be made for trees or whether it really is a matter of looking at the sidewalk code.
I don't know. That's why I'm suggesting we need a little more time to think about it.
Okay. Any feedback on that from anybody? Okay, Jay?
Commissioner Legree? You're muted.
Gotta find my mouse. Once we take possession of it, we say it's on our property, we say we own it. If you put it there, we should probably be the ones to do whatever needs to be done that we deem. In other words, if we think the tree should be taken out, I know my dog's disagreeing with me, but I believe that if we should take the tree out, we should pay for it. Or if we declare it dead or want to move it or something like that. Once we take possession, and I know this is controversial, so that's just my opinion.
I'm going to agree with Commissioner Legree because there are municipalities in the US, big ones like San Francisco, I think maybe is one of them, and they might have changed, but where street trees are actually the responsibility of the adjacent property owner. And Glenn can probably chime in with this. I've taken a couple of tree and law classes, and it doesn't matter how that tree gets on city property. If something happens, the city is ultimately responsible. So if, say, the tree falls and harms someone, it doesn't matter that some homeowner planted it 30 years ago. It was on city property and it harmed somebody. So we will probably end up in a lawsuit. And as we know, when we're in lawsuits, it doesn't matter if we win or lose, we always lose, right? The minute we're in a lawsuit. So just from a practicality standpoint, it makes more sense that the maintenance is uniform and consistent, and that would mean it would run through the city. So, I mean, for example, I might pay, not me, the city might pay $100 to have a tree pruned. You might call somebody to have a tree pruned on your property, the same tree, and it might be $450 because we're pruning 400 trees at a time. You're pruning 1 or 2. So it generally, I mean, it is a higher burden on the city financially at the outset, at least. But if we are serious about taking care of our urban forest, the control of street trees has to be solely under the city.
Have you had instances where we've had to charge back the homeowner for like sidewalk repair? Let me ask it a different way. Have you had a lot of costs associated with sidewalk repair in the last few years?
Well, the city has really taken to, and honestly, this would be a better thing for the Public Works Department probably to speak about, but the city has really taken to a specific company that does sidewalk grinding, and they've budgeted a certain amount every year, and that started a few years ago, just after I started working here. And I think it's been a great program. You know, you have a lot less environmental impact and downtime when you're grinding a crack, but it is only temporary. Better for the trees, better for the environment, not necessarily a long-term solution. There have been a few instances where we can directly attribute, and see, this is one of the problems with this code and our current code is, what's the definition of city tree? Yeah. Who can really tell me what a city tree? So if a homeowner plants a tree on city property without permission, which anybody who's been in Rehoboth long enough knows that's how most of the trees got there. People, well-meaning people, planted trees in the right-of-way 30 years ago, right? Yeah. Because there was no permission system. They thought they were doing the right thing. So is that a city tree? Is the city responsible for that if it damages a sidewalk? Or if it busts up the road or the curb? Or if the tree is naturally grown, like along Columbia and Henlopen, are we responsible for those? Now, if the city planted a tree, it's very obvious we're responsible. To me, it's very obvious we're responsible if it's a naturalized tree. Yeah. And if there's a question mark on where the tree came from and how it got there, I think the city is also responsible. But the way the current code is, we're not really responsible for fixing things for people that planted trees in the right of way. They take on that liability when they plant them.
Right, and I think that's what's going to be different here is that the city will maintain them, and the street tree does become the property of the city. And there's some other language about removal of dead and diseased trees below that we need to look at as well. The issue is whether anything can ever be charged back to the property owner.
In terms of damage, so yeah, I think it's missing. We're missing a whole section on that. What if we have a private property tree grown in the front yard that goes and wraps around a sewer pipe, city sewer, city water main, and crushes it? Or we have a tree from a private property that busts up the road. I mean, I can think of a couple of instances of that. What do? There's nothing in the code to allow us to really charge that back right now. And I'm not sure if we should or shouldn't. Luckily, that's up to you guys. But it does need to be addressed because those things do happen. And then we're left kind of going, well, we got 30 pages of tree code and 50 pages of sidewalk code, and the answer for this situation is not in there.
Okay, all right.
I find some interesting situations. You know, obviously, we're talking about Article 1, which is trees planted on city property. And we've just indicated that the public is allowed to plant them there. And current code indicates they have responsibility for that tree if they plant it on city property, causing any damage to sidewalks, et cetera. I've always had a little heartburn when I see street trees having to be repaired or taken down, or addressing damage to sidewalks. Heartburn in this way, because I don't believe the city has an adequate, complete list of who owns every street tree. You know, I planted some street trees, and I'll bet you don't know which ones I planted. You know, so
Yeah,
that always gives me heartburn. I would offer another perspective on this, that we haven't gotten there yet, but 253.14B, line 129, 30, 31 indicates if the city planted the trees, and I think they're talking about street tree, all costs involved in removing and replacing the street tree and repairing damage to sidewalks and curbs are the city's responsibility. Then the very next line says if a property owner has planted the tree and it needs to be, then it's something, you know, maybe here's another perspective. Maybe it's we should look at it as a blessing that the property owner has taken on the burden of paying for the planting of a tree. Remember, that tree, before it's planted by a private individual, gets the permission from the city arborist to do that. So here we're getting a free tree, and then we're charging it back, maintenance and repair of sidewalks to the owner. Like I said, if it's a memorial tree, the city then claims responsibility for repair of the sidewalk. So to me, that's maybe another perspective that we could look at that. Yes, we can allow the public to plant trees if they get authorization by the city arborist, but then that tree is handed over to the city for maintenance and repairs and et cetera.
yeah.
I think going forward, that makes perfect sense. If we're approving these trees, we can ensure that they're appropriate species with appropriate space.
Right.
The issues will be few and far in between.
Mm-hmm.
What do we do about all the existing trees? Country Club Estates is a perfect example, with all the pear trees planted by the developer there. According to the current code, the city is not responsible for those trees. They're inappropriate species in an inappropriate location. And if we all could go back in time 40 years, they wouldn't have been put there. But
Well, there
what
was
do
a
we
time
do?
when they were very popular.
Hey, the Delaware Urban Forest Service, that was their #1 recommended street tree plant.
I had two at a house I lived in, lost both of them in storms. So I know,
Yeah.
I know they were probably the wrong thing for there either. But let me ask you this, Liz, of the ones that have been taken out in Country Club recently, and there have been several while I've been here, was the repair, was that charged back to the homeowner? I mean, I know the developer put them in, but was that charged back to the homeowner, or did the city pay for that?
Well,
Do you
we've
remember?
had several adjacent private property owners request to remove them, so they paid for that. We've had several removed for city projects where we did both, like, basically we were cutting so close to the tree trunk by mathematical formulation they couldn't have stayed. They were too severe of a hazard. And obviously the city paid for those, but if there was a dying pear tree that needed to be removed, that would be the responsibility of the HOA or the adjacent property owner.
Okay.
Commissioner LeGree, please. Oh, I'm sorry. You're muted.
I go back to whatever the legal liability is, and if we're going to be liable,
Yeah.
we should fess up and do it. And on the other hand, if a private person wants to dig out the tree, I mean, I think we should let them do it. But I'm not sure whether this code will even allow that. So I think we should follow the liability path. Thanks, Mayor.
So how can we conclude this? Are we comfortable with my scenario where we still allow the property owner to plant a street tree. However, upon, after with authorization, of course, and then after planting, it becomes the property and responsibility of the city.
Yeah, that's
and
what I like. Yeah.
responsibility of the city.
I'm getting all nodded heads here, so.
But the question is whether or not we still maintain that if the tree needs to be removed, have the authority to remove it and charge the cost of removal back to the property. I mean, that's really the sentence we're talking about.
Well, can I interject one more time though? Because a huge cost of planting that tree is the maintenance and the watering and the mulching and all
Sure.
that. We need to, if we're allowing people to plant these trees, it needs to be a caveat that they have some sort of maintenance contract for a couple of years that tree is getting water. Because otherwise I think the pruning and all the future maintenance and removal should be on the city. And I think the city should take responsibility if that tree 50 years in the future cracks the sidewalk. But I don't think we should be responsible for watering that tree for 2 years and making sure it gets through its transplant shock. That's too huge of a burden to place on the city without any way to like budget and account for it. Is one person going to take advantage of this or 100? There's no way to know. How are we going to adjust our budget and make sure that we have enough contractors to take care of 100 new street tree plantings that weren't accounted for?
Good point. Good point. We can address that.
Yeah, I don't know how, but I guess we'll have to work on something there. Okay.
Anybody else, Commissioner Legree? Go ahead.
Liz, is that something that you could do with your own discretion, or do we need to say, now you're going to have to go for 2 more years if you plant this tree? Or do you not want to do that?
I think if they plant the tree, typically people are going to want to perform maintenance on it. They're planting it because they want a tree, they want it to look beautiful, but sometimes people don't know what that takes either. So
Right.
I think we can put right in the application or the requirements that you have to have a signed maintenance contract with a watering company or something like that. And it's understood that if the tree doesn't survive the 2-year mark, which is typically when we would do our first training prune anyways for a young tree. So if it doesn't survive or is unhealthy or whatever that 2-year mark, they need to restore it, which would mean removing it and or replacing it, or, maybe we give it another year to see if it bounces back, that type of thing. But I think it can be addressed, if not in the code, at least in the requirements of the planting application.
So how about this? What if we had that, and I can't do this today, but the concept would be that we work that in, that there has to be under an agreement that they would be able to plant a street tree, but under an agreement with the city. So the agreement wouldn't be part of the code, but the code would reference the fact that they have to sign an agreement to do it. But then the rest of this is that if it needs to be removed after that contract expires, after that 2-year period, then the city is going to be responsible for all the repairs and not charge any costs back to the homeowner at that point. Is that?
Yeah. So what I would probably do is essentially like a sign-off inspection, kind of in a way similar to what we do the 2-year mark for new homes, right? I sign off, it's certified and complete after 2 years, the trees all still exist and are healthy. So after 2 years, you go out, we do an inspection, the tree is still in good condition. It's now going to be the responsibility of the city, right?
Right. Okay.
So I think something like that would be appropriate.
Any ideas about?
Go ahead. I'm sorry, say that again, Commissioner Legree.
Liz, any ideas about numbers? Are we talking a half a dozen, 50?
Of people that will plant street trees?
That will do just what you talked about and be tendered for 2 years.
Honestly, I don't think very many, because right now we have a program where if you want to have a street tree planted in front of your house, the city will do it for you. It takes us a while, but I get a few of those a year, 5, 10.
Okay.
So it's not big at this point.
Okay, so I'm comfortable with as Susan outlined it. Thanks.
All right. Are we ready to move on to the next? Does anybody else? Are we ready?
Yeah, obviously we need to do a little homework on this, so we'll do that. And because also, lines 116, 119 have to do with
Yeah.
pruning of trees, et cetera. So, that needs to be incorporated in
It
the.
comes up in several places. Yep.
Right.
Okay.
All right, go ahead,
So
Susan.
if we're going through it in order, it's interesting that tree topping, I think, is in the current code. Hat racking is also been in language somewhere. Yeah, actually it's I think in the current code, it's just topping, but in the planning commission revision, they added hat racking. So as both of those things being prohibited. So that's what's here. That's where it comes from.
Okay.
And let's see, then you get to pruning. And I believe that, well, first of all, in terms of the distances, the requirement to prune 12 feet above the street and 8 feet above the sidewalk has not changed. That's the code now, and it's been maintained in every revision. It was in the PC revision, planning commission revision, that they added that the city shall have the right to prune any tree when it intrudes, and charge the cost of pruning to the property owner. And that's really the thing we need to talk about. Do we want to keep that in there?
Well, again, these are trees on city property, so they're between it's a street tree. We're not yet.
Let me just interrupt you. Say it's not necessary, because I had this problem with my Japanese cherry, where the branches are enormous and they hung, and I got them trimmed this year because I knew that they were lower than 8 feet. They were probably about 7 feet off.
Are you talking about a tree that's on your private property?
Yeah, but it's not a street tree. And it's, I don't even know that it's in the setback. It's back like 20 feet. It just has these huge limbs. So I think
but that's my point. We're talking about Article 1 city trees. We're not yet talking about trees on private property. So I'm addressing street trees. This is giving the responsibility of the owner of any tree overhanging a street right away. So that would be only the owners, as I interpret it, that have planted a street tree within its first 2 years before it's handed over to the city. And I know from old days with Greg Freese that trees, this was something seldom ever enforced, including private trees overhanging. It was seldom ever enforced. And Greg Freese finally told Mel, the public works director, to start trimming all the trees that were overhanging sidewalks. So I'm wondering if we shouldn't do the same thing and just codify that it becomes a city tree at a certain point and it has the responsibility. Again, this is for street trees, interfering with lights and overhanging sidewalks and everything. Just the city, I think, just needs to take on that responsibility.
But here's the thing. I actually think, and I'll have to look in Article 2 and see if it's carried over. I think this is a paragraph that's referring to any tree, not just a tree, but any tree that intrudes into public space. And maybe it shouldn't be in this article. I don't know, but I think that's what it says.
I think it should be in this article specific to street trees. I think it should also be repeated appropriately and with any changes in Article 2. But how can we start saying all of a sudden that we've been talking about everything in Article 1 has to do with trees in parks and city street trees, and now we're saying selectively in Article 1 certain things are going to apply to private trees? I would disagree with that, and an appropriate time would be to talk about that in Article 2.
Okay, well then that'll be a change from the current code, but I agree it might be cleaner. I think the reason it's here is because this article is about public property, but public trees, but also public property. So that's why it's here.
Commissioner Gay, I think you're right with the intent of it in the current code is that it's because those trees are overhanging public space.
Right.
Not necessarily because they are street trees and whoever planted that street tree has to prune it. and we do enforce this. But we also, the city itself, every off season, we hire contractors and have in-house staff that goes through every intersection and every street to make sure we have nothing hanging low for city trees. So I've always directed my staff in-house, if it's something that takes them 5 minutes to clean up a little tree that's blocking a stop sign, and it's not in big cuts, to go ahead and do it in-house. If it becomes dramatic, like for example, Commissioner Gay, would you want some random city staff to come chop on your cherry tree that you've spent all this time and money on? No. There are plenty of residents that feel that way. They'd rather take care of it themselves. So I've always given them the option, especially if it's good
And
amount.
I'm fine with that explanation, provided we give this a little more clarity. Again, are we, if we put in there and clarify that we're talking about street trees as well as trees on private property, I'd almost change the title, pruning of trees overhanging public space or something like that.
Wait, so you would expand it beyond street trees?
I'm comfortable either way, but if we were going to extend it beyond street trees, I think it needs to have in there that a specific reference to privately owned trees as well.
Okay,
I just don't think it's clear.
okay. All right, well,
I don't know, 6 one, half dozen the other, perhaps.
I can say once again, this is something that we've not really had much pushback. The few times we've had to mention it to people, they were like, oh, absolutely. And they took care of it. So just something that was overlooked.
so then do we want to take out B where it's the city shall have the right to charge the pruning to the property owner? You actually don't, you're saying you don't do that, Liz?
Hold on, let me read it. The pruning.
116 through 119.
I don't think we've ever charged pruning back to a property owner. I don't think we've ever charged tree removal back to a property owner. I think it's necessary on private property. If somebody has a dead tree and they are, it wouldn't be encompassed in this article, but if, for example, they're refusing to remove it, we can't get a hold of them, whatever it may be, the city needs to have that right to go in there and alleviate that hazard for public safety. But I don't see, if we're taking full responsibility for all street trees, if that's what we've decided, it's kind of a moot point.
Okay. Well,
Responsibility for all street trees, except for trees planted by private property owners as a street tree within the first 2 years.
Yes.
I'm going to strike B then. Okay. All right. Yeah.
Commissioner Gay,
Yes.
before you strike it, just as an afterthought, since the language there talks only about the right to prune and the authority to charge, it doesn't say we would do it. It just says you've got a right and you've got an authority. Do we think we would ever need that for some unknown situation that we can't currently imagine, rather than strike it? To me, if it's there and you need it,
Yeah, that's a good point.
that's better than it's not there. We really did need it, and now we're caught holding the bag somehow.
I think that's a very good point.
That's
Thank
an
you.
excellent point.
Leave it in.
Okay. So to make matters even more complicated, down to removal of dead and diseased trees and costs. And this is, I tell you, Mary, you're making some excellent points about where this falls in the code, and it really, and maybe the chapter, maybe the article has to be renamed to something about public property as well as public trees, because A talks about the city having the right, as Liz just gave an example, to remove any dead or diseased trees on private property within the city when they constitute a hazard. And it then says this includes trees planted between the curb and the sidewalk. regardless of if the tree was planted by the city or others, but it includes everything, private property trees and city trees. So what do you want to do there? It's basically the city's rights. I mean, I guess this whole paragraph is like what the city can do, what their authority is, right? That's what this article is.
I don't know. I think as we develop some of the previous language, and this should fall in place.
If I can weigh in, I think that Article 1 should be viewed as anything occurring in the public space. So if it's trees that are encroaching, whether they're on private property or not, but they're encroaching the public space and we need to prune, then it should fall into this section. It seems here where we're talking about removal of dead or diseased trees on private property, it seems that we'd need that section really in both Article 1 and Article 2, because it could be a tree that's causing a hazard in the public space, as it could fall into the public space, or a tree that's in the private property that could cause a hazard for some other reason in the private space. So that provision I'd probably have in both Article 1 and Article 2. But I think that Article 1 should be looked at as anything that's occurring in the public space should be addressed in Article 1. You know, the Commissioner Gay mentioned maybe retitling it, because the title of this section is City Parks and Shade Tree Commission, Regulation of Trees on Public Property. But I think it really should be on public property or encroaching public space or something like that.
Yeah, if you go back to my recommendation of 253-13, current title is Pruning of Overhanging Trees. I had suggested that maybe it be changed to Pruning of trees overhanging public space. Glenn, if we go back and we're all mindful to the title of Article 1, it includes regulation of trees on public property. So I think what you just articulated is a good program.
All right. So it would need to be in both places, but we need for A to say that it constitutes a hazard to public space.
I think something along those lines, just to clarify, it's public. We're talking about public spaces.
Okay. And then B is where you get into if the city planted the tree or if the property owner planted the tree. And this is obviously talking about street trees.
Commissioner Costa, just one quick question or clarification. On line 126, we talk about trees planted between the curb and sidewalk. To be consistent, should we also include the word curb line there?
Probably so.
Thank you, Commissioner.
Okay. So B is where we need to resolve, do we determine who planted the tree or not? Yes, Commissioner Sharp.
So I'm focused only on the first 6 words, I think, if the city planted the tree. And my question is, do we have, and I think I know the answer, so I just wanted to confirm, do we have ironclad records on who planted?
No, I don't think we do. Do we, Liz?
I have ironclad records on the 6 years of what the city has planted. If we want to go back 7 years, I have to shrug my shoulders because I have some papers, but honestly, my understanding is the city just really didn't do any street tree planting, frankly.
So I get it. I completely understand Liz's response. My question is only around a tree planted 8 years ago that we honestly don't have any records.
Well,
how does this, do we just assume it is a city tree in practicality?
So sometimes we use some good old common sense. Sometimes there are records in the building and licensing files in which trees had to be replaced through either park and shade or through that building process. you'd be surprised. Those files upstairs do hold a lot of information. So sometimes we can track it right back to there, a letter from former city manager saying you authorizing to remove a tree as long as it's replaced. I mean, you got all kinds of things going on there. But also I know that if we go to a house on Henlopen Avenue, for example, and there are 4 Leland cypresses in a hedge planted on city property, the city did not plant those Leland cypresses in a hedge in front of one individual private property. Ironclad? No, but I mean, that's the best we can do for that type of stuff, I think.
But if we go with the premise that after 2 years of planting, the city takes responsibility for them, then doesn't this resolve itself? Because I'm sure we can identify what's been planted within the last 2 years, and we don't need to go beyond that any further.
Yeah, it just doesn't address the 40 years of legacy plantings or anything planted between now and then without authority. So if we have a tree planted on a city street that, say, wasn't authorized, they didn't apply because their families lived here for 80 years and they didn't realize, and it's an oak tree in a 3-foot right of way, what are we supposed to do? It's not going to be a tree that's approved. Do I want to go and rip it out of the ground? I don't know.
No, but again, I believe if we go with that program where if the property owner plants and they have to be responsible for 2 years, I think every street tree beyond that 2-year age is the responsibility of the city. That's what I'm hearing we're headed toward.
Well, but as well as legacy tree, as well as those that we don't know.
Anything over 2 years old.
I see. Okay.
Okay.
Commissioner Sharp, and then Glenn.
Mayor, I think that clarifies for me that going forward, which is really the spirit of this, is what it sounds like. Going forward, if anything is on city property, there really isn't a debate of who it belongs to. It belongs to the city, and everything associated with it belongs to the city.
After it gets beyond that 2-year mark for private property owners that get permission to plant a street tree in front of their property.
Okay, when you just added that, if they get permission.
I did.
Now go the other way. If they didn't get permission and it's still there, it's still ours.
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, the easiest example of that, once again, are the pear trees and country club estates. Do we want to take on responsibility for them?
I can only say my personal opinion is if it is on city property and you want to be consistent and fair throughout the city, it belongs to the city and everything associated to it. That's just me.
I think that's a lot simpler than what I've been doing, and it would make my job easier. It will cost us more money. I'll just put that out there. The cost of pruning all those pears in country club estates, if we even so deemed they were worthy of pruning, will be a whole year's pruning budget. So that'll take our 5-year cycle to 6, which means we either have to fund the money.
Liz, it could still be maintained on a 5-year cycle. We would just need to decide seriously to fund it.
Yes. I just want to make sure that we're keeping those implications in mind, that this, I think it's a lot easier. I think it's prudent of the city to take on that responsibility. But it will cost us time and money.
And I think that's a very, very valid point, because there is no free lunch. But Liz, my question to you would be, would you anticipate any pushback? Let's just use the example of country club estates. If the city did what I just said, which is take full responsibility.
If I went in and decided for, about 4 years ago, I wanted to do a pear tree replacement program to start getting them out of there and replaced. So yeah, if I think, I know for a fact there are street trees planted by private property owners that if we went in and started doing things, they I've had it happen to me. I've had people call and scream and yell. So yes, it will create some angst. That doesn't mean it's not the right thing to do though.
Right. So fundamentally, as we continue to talk and make these decisions, if we keep in mind how we would need to do proper outreach and proper explanations of why we're doing these things, because it would be more consistent, more fair. I think that could go a long way. But I'm all for simplicity, fairness, and beautification. So that's where I stand.
Well, I think there's also some benefits, and then we get the trees cut on a consistent routine and generally at the same time. Whereas right now, if you're depending on the property owner, then every other tree might get trimmed every third year. And so, again, I think there's some benefit to do that. And yes, there is some cost to the city to do that, but overall, I think we have much better control, and it's a good program. Commissioner Legree, please.
So I think I'm hearing that you are not going to allow the homeowners to maintain the trees in front of their house that are on public property
After 2 years.
after 2 years.
Well, couldn't they apply? Isn't it in the code, the draft that they could apply to? I think earlier we talked to about it. No,
Are you
253.11b.
Are you finding that that's happening?
Yes, there are private adjacent private properties that prune street trees for better or for worse, and I would say most of the time for worse, honestly.
Well, and they're getting permission to do that.
No, they're just doing it.
That was my question.
Now there has been people throughout the years who have asked me if they could prune a branch to get into a driveway, for example, or it overhangs their property, and legally they can prune whatever overhangs their property within reason. We can't deny them that, but I think it makes it a lot easier if the city took over maintenance of all street trees, honestly.
But I think I'm hearing you say that we just don't have the money to do that, or that we would double or triple our. Go ahead.
I won't say we don't have the money. That's your guys' illustrious job. Is we would just have to budget more, frankly. Is it worth it? You know, I think yes. I think that the people in Country Club Estates, they're paying their taxes like everybody else. They have street trees that the city encouraged them to plant or required them to plant. I'm not sure. And it's not really their fault that in 1980, that was the right tree. That was the tree everybody recommended and was $15 at the nursery. I think it's appropriate we take care of them.
Do we have the budget to do Park and Henlopen and Columbia? How does that work?
So last year I did Columbia and Henlopen, but really, I mean, you guys know the right-of-ways of those go 35, 40 feet when you get close to the ocean. The city owns so much land. We did dead, dying, and pruning back from the road. And it was not without a lot of pushback, even after appropriate notification protocols were followed, because we all know people don't necessarily read our social media, our website, or letters sent to them. So that's why I know there will be pushback. Was it still the right thing to do? Absolutely.
Yeah, a tree needs to be trimmed. Tree needs to be trimmed. Do any of the homeowners do that now?
I mean, on Columbia and Henlopen, yeah. I mean, I know when you come to the end of Columbia, there's a few really huge oaks, and one of the original property owners told me that they were all planted in about 1950, 1960. And he's that owner. He planted, and a bunch of them went in on it together and just planted them in in that area, 20 feet in front of their house, 20 feet from the road, well, that's city property. I mean, to prune each of those trees, like really thoroughly prune it like it was your house tree, that's $1,000 job a tree. Is
anybody doing that now?
I think they actually all do a pretty good job maintaining them. So the city would come through and we would clear it back from the road. We would take out dead branches, but we're not doing like clearing trees from people's roofs on their, when they overhang their private property. We're not making driveway clearances where they overhang private property, because we get into a lot of trespassing issues then. And that is not common for municipalities to do. I will say it's what they typically do is dead limbs and clearance. They don't protect like the individual private property, with the exception of the dead limbs.
I can see this mushrooming into a fairly expensive proclamation if we decide that we don't want them pruning trees that are in front of their property that are street trees.
Well, keep in mind, they'll still have the right to prune wherever it hangs over their property. So if it's touching their roof, they have not just the right really, but the responsibility to prune that back. And that's where we get into earlier. We had talked about the city shall provide adequate maintenance. What is adequate maintenance? Dead limbs, road clearance, roof clearance from private property. Then we would have to get permission from every individual property owner to access their property. Then if the tree limb dropped on their property, we'd have insurance claims. I mean, it like you said, Commissioner Legree, it really would snowball if we take on that responsibility. But there is a median, which is the level of pruning we provide now, and then adding on every other single street tree with that same level of pruning.
Well, I think we've got, Susan, I think you've got some direction going forward on all these topics. And I think it'd be worthwhile to be mindful that, this is meeting number 1 of 7+ meetings. And so if we actually get it written up so that we can come back to it again, and it'll give us more time to think about it, Commissioner Legree, and about the responsibility on the city and whether we indeed truly want to go that direction versus putting more responsibility or maintaining responsibility on the property owner for trimming trees. Anything else, Commissioner Legree?
Yeah, thank you for that clarification. I think we have homeowners that are doing a whole lot more than we realize throughout the city pruning trees, and you just hate to get them hacked off. But anyway, you can see where I'm going. Thanks, Mayor.
Thank you. Commissioner Gay, anything further?
No, I just, as we've seen, there's a lot of overlap in consistency needed in the whole maintenance, pruning, and removal of dead and diseased trees. I think we have work to do on those, but that's good. I think that's probably where all the overlap stops. So the next, we can go through the next ones hopefully a little faster. The next one is the removal of stumps, and that does not change at all. It's been exactly the same in all versions of the code. So I don't, unless anybody has any comments, we'll leave that one in there.
Commissioner, I would like to make a comment.
Okay.
If we could remove park trees from that, all street tree stumps should be ground, but there are many park trees where it's actually detrimental.
Okay, yeah, that's a good point, actually. Okay, thank you for mentioning that. Okay, so street trees, and I assume that was I assume it was put in the code to begin with for public safety, that for it to be removed below the surface, but whatever. Yeah, okay. Abuse of public trees is something that's been in every version as well. In our current ordinance, it's prohibited, but no penalty is stated, I don't believe. It was the Planning Commission draft that first established liability, which is line 146. Any person who violates, these are questions for Glenn. that any person who violates this section is joint and severally liable for all damages. In the law oversight draft, they didn't address specifically abuse of trees. The only thing that's there in terms of a penalty is that the failure of property owners to maintain trees as required would be assessed civil penalties and or required to compensate the city for repair. So I guess I just want to see what's the right thing. Are we talking civil penalties? Is there a need, what's the other liability issues? How should we fix this?
So those are all good questions. When the tree ordinance was adopted in 2006, I was a brand new city solicitor, and there was an interest in making sure that the ordinance stuck. So we had a case of a property owner who took down, I want to say it was 16 trees. And I remember being in the Court of Common Pleas in Georgetown on a criminal trial, picking the jury as it was snowing, the one day of the year that it snowed. So, I mean, traditionally it was a criminal deal, but I mean, I think I would suggest at this point that we probably make these civil offenses under our civil offense section. It's easier for city staff to, implement those sorts of charges and enforcement mechanisms. So I can give you language on that, but I think that's the direction I would recommend going.
And we've done that with a lot of other.
That's right.
We've made them consistent. Okay.
That's right.
Then that's fine with me.
Okay.
Anybody else on that one? Okay, and then the license provision is there, just to clarify that all contractors working in the city will be licensed. But that's occupation. I mean, I assume, yeah, it's business or occupation, so it doesn't apply to the owner who's just doing some pruning. And then the last one, and Glenn, I'll ask you a question about this one too, on 18. I don't actually, this has been in the code since the beginning. I wonder if it's a little misplaced here. There's obviously a very big appeal section in Article 2. So I don't know why, and obviously what's stated here is true, that the city commissioners have the right to review the decisions of the Parks and Shade Tree, but does it need to be here if it's covered in the appeal section elsewhere?
I agree with you that we should collapse it all into one appeal section. I think if you recall, we did just introduce an ordinance, didn't we, that would revise this section, even though this whole effort's going on right now, to clarify that appeals are de novo, they have to be filed within 30 days. So, I mean, on the record, not de novo. But I do think that if there's an ability to collapse the entire appeal section into one section, it should be done that way.
And then, so in that case, would it be okay to delete a reference to that here and just delete 253.18?
I think I'd have to see the final version of it. So I want to be sure that, appeals, whether they be related to public property or private property, are addressed adequately.
Okay, so I'll just make a note that this may be dropped pending the final version of the appeals section.
Yeah, we might actually consider, you all as commissioners might consider doing an Article 3 that is just titled Appeals, and then we know it addresses the entire chapter.
Not a bad idea, because it's big. I mean, it's a third. The appeal section is a full third of the entire law oversight version, and it's several pages in all the other versions. So
well, it's one of the most important things that the Parks and Shade Tree Commission does. So
yeah.
Well, just a reminder, on January 21st of this year is when we amended the code, section 253-20 in reference to appeals. So we need to make sure that is incorporated in whatever we end up with.
Okay, we'll look at that. And so make a note that this may go away as such in favor of either an Article 3 or covering it somewhere else. May go away. I mean, that's finally at 11:18. That's it for review of this. Oh, I'm sorry, Commissioner Bennett seems to have a question. So can I ask him?
Yeah, Commissioner Bennett.
Yeah, just for clarification on 253.16, where it says abuse of public trees, through most of the copy, it's private, city, or street trees. I'm just wondering, we don't mention public trees in language. I'm just wondering if we should define that or just make that clearer. Since we've been talking about city, private, and street trees, public just seems to come out of the blue there for me.
Interesting. Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So define as street or on city property. Okay, I'll look at that.
I think it's just the issue of having consistent language all the way through.
Yeah, yeah. Mayor, there's one other issue I wanted to bring up that's not specific to the language in here, but if we're finished going through the specific paragraphs for today, do you want to take public comment first, or do you want me to keep going?
There is no public comment at this point. If you remember, Dave deferred, and Hoyt Decker has logged off. I do want to give everybody the opportunity to just mention whatever they would like to, as long as it references Article 1 only. So you want to go first, and then I've got a comment. We'll
Okay. Yeah, my comment is that I would really like to have, you know where I'm going with this. I would really like to have a code review of the entire code and before we adopt it, to make sure, because, and I sort of view code review as separate from legal review, because it looks at you know what other codes are done, what the standards are by people who have read, you know, a million of these kind of codes. And I think there's some good news there, in that my understanding is that the current review we're having done of our code is moving along and is maybe almost completed, according to an update we got from Sharon. So I'm wondering if perhaps that review has already done some comparison of the existing tree ordinance with other parts of the code. Maybe we can pick up some benefit from the work that's already been done. But otherwise, I'm not trying to slow it down at all. As I said earlier, I really want to move ahead with this as quickly as we can. But I wonder if it can be done simultaneously with our review. So in other words, we reach basically a consensus about Article 1, and we get that code reviewed while we're working on Article 2. You know, and one part of the reason I say this is look at what happened with 5G. You know, I mean, the code was passed over 2 years ago, and yet then we discovered the problems. And so now it's being revised in you know, infinite numbers of meetings and a lot of time. So I guess I would like to avoid, you know, unnecessary legal issues and unnecessary appeals and having to be in a situation like we're in with 5G, where we find out 6 months from now, oh, we didn't address X, Y, and Z, and we need to go back. That's all.
Right, Susan, what we'll do is I'll confer with Sharon, and we'll at least get a report for the next meeting on how we might be able to move ahead and give you a status report on the code review there. Now, I want to clarify, when I think we need to be specific. You said code review, that's specific to the tree code review, not the entirety of the code. Okay, so I want to clarify there.
Yeah.
Very good, thank you. So we'll bring that back to you. I have a note here, something about removal of, and I don't know where it came from, but somebody somewhere said something to me about removal of street trees. Removal of street trees now can be requested by property owner. Again, I gave you the example, if they want to, they're adamant about putting their driveway on the left side, and that's exactly where the tree is. Somebody mentioned to me whether that really should be the purview of the Parks and Shade Tree Commission or not, or whether that should be at the discretion of the arborist. Does anybody know or will admit that they told me that? Is there any merit to any of it? Hearing nothing, we're going to let it go, but think about it. Are there any other general commissioner comments before we close out? Commissioner Sharp?
I just have one general question for Commissioner Gay. If just very briefly, you could articulate what the real spirit of Article 1 in plain vanilla English is intended to be.
Well, I have to think about it for a minute. if you
Well,
have.
and not to put you on the spot, but if you want to kick off our next meeting with that, you could do that as well, because I'm going to have that same question about Article 2.
Right.
So it doesn't have to be today, but folks are always asking either in a complimentary way or a not so complimentary way, what is the city really trying to do?
Right.
And why are they doing it? So having something very clear on that might be helpful for all of us. And it does not have to be today.
Well, yeah, I mean, in general, I had said at the beginning that the whole goal of, of the tree ordinance is to maintain and grow the canopy. And I felt like that Article 1, puts forward the city's intentions and the city's obligations. In other words, it doesn't all fall to the property owner. A lot of it falls to the city, and it's just a matter of balance. And that to me is the reason to have the two articles. In addition to that, Article 1 also provides the city authority to do certain things, and as you pointed out earlier, the need to maintain the authority, even if it's not something we do on a daily basis. But it's all for growing and maintaining the urban forest. It's just that there's different groups involved with that. One is the city role, and the other is the property owner's role.
So just to wrap it up, on part of how you began this session with the goals, the urban forestry plan, that sounds like it's very, very fundamental to accomplishing what you just described. That's going to be something we really need to focus on, or find out how it's going to be and when it's going to be implemented.
Yeah.
Is that fair?
Yes, I think that's fair. That's why I wanted it to be in the in this as a required document. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Commissioner Gossett?
Yes, thank you. I just wanted to follow up with Commissioner Gay's comments about the code review. And I know that currently we are doing a general code is reviewing our current code, which will involve the tree ordinance. But there's so much change that has gone into this new draft. Would it be possible for general code, and this is addressed City Manager Lynn, to see if this could be done, if general code could look at our current draft, just again to see if we're headed in the right direction, or there's newer language or newer ways to handle things that we have not been exposed to.
Yeah, I agree, and that was, I believe, Susan's intent for them to review the hybrid proposal. In fact, not just the hybrid proposal, but it would need to be version 2 and any subsequent versions that we update as to reflect our conversations. Anything else, Commissioner Gossett?
No, thank you.
Thank you. Are there any further comments from any of the commissioners before we start the process to adjourn? If not, again,
I want to ask I guess a technical question about the next step and how we move forward.
well, let me explain my thing, and then you can insert in there. If we go back to our itinerary, meeting number 1, we were supposed to address only Article 1, and I think we've achieved that. However, meeting number 2, we're supposed to start on Article number 2, sections 19 through 26. I think what we're missing here on the itinerary is inclusion of continued discussion on previous meetings. So what I'd like to do is modify this itinerary so that at our next meeting, we will start off with a review of Article 1, go through only those details that are different. So Susan, we need to somehow do a red line version or highlight somehow what the changes are so that we can address that. Probably using a red line version would be the best. And then after we complete that task, move on to articles, Article 2, sections 19 through 26, with the understanding that at some point during the meeting, we're going to have to conclude when we get to a certain point. We may not get all the way to section 26. So we're just going to have to play it by ear again. I thought this was an excellent session. I want to let you know that the next The next meeting is likely to be February 15th. Susan, if that's enough time, you and I can talk. We have to post the agenda on the 8th, February 8th. So I want to give you a little time to make sure that we are done. I would hate to come back before we are indeed ready. So we've got a little time if we need. But otherwise, tentatively pencil in the 15th. The other option would be the 22nd. Again, I hope to do these at all special meetings. All the special meetings would be on Tuesdays, beginning at 9 a.m. I would intend to or hope to alternate the special meetings on Tuesdays with discussions on outdoor dining and any other special things so that we are not conducting tree meetings back to back to back. It's just very challenging to do that on a weekly basis. So from there, Susan, did you have anything you want to do?
You answered the question of the intent, which would be to go back to the changes we made in Article 1 before we do Article 2. So two things about that. First of all, do we have time to make those changes in the next, I guess, 10 days? A lot of them will involve communications with Glenn. Glenn, are you comfortable with that schedule?
Yep, I'm good to go.
Okay.
Mhm.
And then the second thing is, if we do that, if we start the next meeting talking about Article 1, then my guess is that we're going to get through about 2 paragraphs of Article 2. That's okay, as long as we know that. I don't think we can get through, half of Article 2 the way I originally envisioned. That's fine. As long as we know that.
That's fine. I think the main thing to know is that, we've just started this and proving with the next meeting that we will maintain the momentum and keep this going. Again, maybe not on a weekly basis, but hopefully every other week, at worst case, every third week, depending upon our homework level that we're able to achieve. Are there any further comments from Susan or the commissioners? If not, I again want to pat Commissioner Gay on the back. She's done a phenomenal amount of homework on this, a lot of time committed to this, talking with the different groups. And again, I want to thank Law Oversight Committee, Parks and Shade Tree Commission, the Planning Commission, Tree and Green Infrastructure, and all the members and chairs of those groups that have provided a good foundation for this resumption of the tree code review. With that, I thank you again, and we will adjourn this meeting.